Hi, everyone. Welcome to EDU 429. This is a podcast support tool so that you can best utilize your time on Monday, April 3rd and Wednesday, April 5th while I am unavailable. Well, actually, I'm available during that time, but not physically with you. So please use this supportive podcast as well as the resources that I put in the announcements within Blackboard to best utilize and leverage your learning while I am gone. So as we work through this podcast, you will probably want access to the rest of your computer and other resources, and it might be beneficial to be in conversation with your peers at the same time. So just to keep things simple, we want to start really with having your green rubric available for the assessment data and grading. And really let's start by looking at the research section for grading. And if you notice in that section, there is a list of questions. And really, as you select videos to watch or websites that I've given you to access, the intention is that you literally can go question by question and resolve those questions or answer them based on the research. So all the spaces and places that I'm having you visit, those resources are credible sources that you can then cite and use within your research. And remember, the research section of the rubric is meant to say what's all the research going on in that specific arena. And then the next section asks you for your beliefs. So the next section then says, what is it of the research that you believe and what will you do, or what are the actions then based on that research? So remember, within the research section for grading, we want to know what the purposes are for grading. We want to know what are scales and systems being used. And then we want to know what are those questionable practices and what might be some alternatives to resolve that. And then in the next section, when you talk to me about your beliefs, then you're telling me, based on the research, these are the things that I will or will not do. Okay, so keep that in mind. In the list that I gave you, I would personally focus on these grading links. If you're still struggling with assessment, I did give you a few extras, but I would really focus on these ones. And so I've just given you a bunch of different YouTube and MyStreamNet and some other sources. Some of them are playlists, and I've indicated if that's the case, you don't need to watch, for say, all 51 of the videos in that playlist, but specifically check out Rick Warmelli. I've tried to also indicate to you if it's going to be long or short. But again, these are wonderful tools for you, and you can see who the big names are that I think are worth citing and listening to. For example, Rick Warmelli, Doug Reeves, Thomas Guskey, Ken O'Connor, Carol Dweck, Myron Dweck. Some of these names you should recognize from other articles I've already given you or from the article Share and Swap, but this will give you a good foundation. Another quality source to consider is the Michigan Assessment Consortium, as well as the REMC, which is the MyStreamNet source. So something that's interesting about grading is that it's really not Michigan specific, and that it's really across the nation that we should look at these practices. And if you're really thinking about teaching internationally, please also look at it from an international lens, because the United States has their own strengths and weaknesses to their grading system, and they have their own culture around what grades mean. So if you want to go outside that lens, there's still lots of great credible research outside the lens of the United States. In fact, Canada does some really amazing things. Michael Fullen and Ken O'Connor have done a lot of work in Canada around the grading practices. So my suggestion for you is, before moving on to an activity, your first role right now is to just pause this video, use your rubric, use these links, and it should take you maybe half an hour to an hour of your time to just start watching things, take notes, use your own organizational system. Okay, so if you go ahead and do that, just pause me, and when you're ready to start back up, you can. Okay, so now this means welcome back. You've already done a lot of your research and your listening and reading and watching videos of what's going on in the grading practices world right now. So now I want you to start to transition and think about what is it that you will actually do. And when we think about those, what will you actually do, we want to house that at a couple of different levels. So kind of similarly in assessment, how we have the spectrum of assessment where it goes from talking about a really little item, like one single item on one single assessment, to talking about the assessment as a whole, to talking about a bunch of assessments together, to talking about the whole system. Grading has that kind of different vantage point, unit vantage point, going from how do you grade a single assignment or assessment, just one single one. What do you write at the top? What do you do you use a deficit model or a positive model? Carol Dweck talks about, are you the teacher that marks up in the corner -2? Or are you the teacher that writes up in the corner, +8 out of 10, focusing on the positive? So maybe you're a person that's not going to use a numeric scale, but instead use descriptors, or couple a letter grade with accurate feedback. And we know there's different ways to give accurate feedback. So the first kind of lens of thought is going to go to, what do you want an actual marking to report on a single assignment or assessment? And then the next level to think about is, say that assignment or assessment gets reported in your grade book. And there's a great article, I think I reminded you of it earlier, about the myth of the objective computerized grade book. I'm totally saying the wrong name, but I think you know which one I'm talking about. So anyways, then you start to think about, do I weight certain assignments or assessments certain ways? Are some assessments more important than others? What assessments am I choosing to include as a representation of my students' whole learning? So you're going to decide which things to include and which things not to include. And if you choose to include them, how much weight do they have? Maybe your final exam that's cumulative, or your final assessment or super huge project has more weight than a unit of study that was maybe less important or less critical overall. So you'll start to decide the weights of different assignments and what exactly you want to include. And eventually you're going to have to figure out what's your system that is going to report out all the learning within your unit, or within and around, your course. So we go from single assessment, what's the grade on that, to maybe a progress report, or how would you communicate progress over a larger amount of assignments and assessments, to then how do you calculate a grade or multiple grades for an entire course, and what does that look like? Okay, so again, you're looking at these different kind of size units, and you have to decide what's right for you. So there's not one right way to do that. So if this sounds super overwhelming, which I'm sure it probably does, just remember there's not one right way to do that. So standards-based is its own way of doing it, and there's lots of right ways to do standards-based, and then traditionals at the other end of the spectrum, but there's all this gray space in between. So you can pick and choose which things that you want to do. Okay, so this is where this tool comes in. I hope you can see that. It doesn't look very straight. Okay, so when you look at this, remember that we talked about everything comes back to the purpose of your grades. So the first thing you need to consider would be, what do you want the purpose of your grades to be? So do you want your grades to communicate to parents and students products, meaning their academic product, how proficient they are on certain criteria? That would be mastery of learning. That is representing academic achievement. That means your end grade, whether it be a letter or a numerical scale or a 4-point scale, whatever. Is the purpose of that to represent academic mastery, or what else might it measure? So for me, I think it's important to measure and keep track of, as well as report out on, academic mastery. So, are you mastering the content standards that I'm setting forth? I would also separately measure process, which would be in our world habits of mind, or excuse me, dispositions. But it's anything non-academic related, but some people like Northwest call them soft skills, or South Lyon calls them habits of mind. So things like punctuality, behavior, effort, those kinds of things. What becomes really difficult when we say we want to measure those things or want to reinforce those things because we think they're of value, it becomes a little bit difficult because we're putting a very subjective judgment on something that's very hard to measure. For example, my perceptions of somebody's effort might be very different than their own perceptions of their effort. So, who am I to judge your effort, right? So, again, if you want to measure and give feedback on those things or track those things and whatnot, make sure you're doing it in a very clear, methodical, evidenced kind of way. Sometimes maybe the best way to measure those things are through self-assessments. So when students tell you how much effort they're putting in, or they show you their behaviors and that they're tracking their behaviors, those then become more meaningful, and set a foundation for a conversation much more than some teacher's judgment about some student's behavior. Okay, so again, right now I have two purposes, and if I were to say those two purposes were really, really important to me, I would communicate those as separate and not aggregate that into one hodgepodge grade. So I might say I would like a letter grade to communicate academic achievement, and I would like to use a descriptive grade plus comment feedback to address process. Okay, but I also may be interested in documenting and tracking progress. And progress is really this growth. And in order to measure growth, we have to know where people start. So the start and end of this, if you have a start and end point, that's the only way you can actually show progress. So you can have academic progress, and that would be like a simple version of that would be measuring a student's growth by giving a pretest and then a post-test. That was an oversimplified example, but so you can have academic progress, and you can also have non-academic progress. So if a student starts out at the beginning of the year and they have tons of behavioral infractions, but over the course of the year those decrease, then we should celebrate that progress. So just know that if you think it's important to measure progress, whether it's academic progress or non-academic progress, and report out that growth, then that means you have to have a starting point. So if you're getting to the end of the semester and you never did any kind of pre-diagnostic or baseline data gathering, then there's no way that you can show growth. An example in our class, how I was intentionally trying to measure growth, or the pictures where we did the consensogram, where I asked to what extent you were comfortable and confident with data, to what extent you're comfortable and confident with assessment, blah, blah, blah. And so when you go back at the end of this unit and put your new sticky notes on, I can accurately report out data as to your growth. Also, when we have time to go back and revisit our original graphic representations and show that we have changed from beginning to end in our thinking, that's another way that I'm showing academic growth over time. So if I just had you create those graphics at the end of the unit, then that may be representing product and academic mastery, but that doesn't measure accurately growth because it doesn't have a starting point. Okay, so again, before you make any decisions about scales or about what's included and what's not, you first have to go to your purpose. And if your purpose is more than one thing, so if your purpose is more than just academic mastery, or if your purpose is more than just growth, then you need to make sure that you keep those scales separate